Okay, this is lecture 3 from chapter 1. We finished up the last lecture. We were talking about the phases of the business cycle, and we have 6 phases. We have expansion, peak, contraction, downturn, trough, and recovery. The thing to note about these is the first 3 are above the trend line, right here. The expansion is when the economy is growing and when above the trend line. Peak is when the that growth is uh, peaking out. A contraction is when growth is beginning to decline before it gets back to the trend line. Then downturn is below the trend line, and then a trough and is when would be downturn is the beginning of a recession, or and then trough is when the recession bottoms out, and recovery is again below the trend line when the economy, after it reaches its trough and starts to economic growth starts to increase again. Those are the phases of the business cycle. Uh, so, future direction of the economy. What we're talking about here is economic indicators. Economic indicators gives you an idea of how well the economy is doing. Well, gross domestic product is a cyclical indicator. So when gross domestic product is going up, the economy is doing well. So when if it's declining, the economy is doing poorly. So um, it's but it these movements are in conjunction. So gross domestic product isn't going to predict the future. So and same for unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is countercyclical. So if unemployment rate's going up, then the economy's doing poorly. But vice versa, if the kind of unemployment rate is going down, the economy is doing well. So uh, some of the most important uh, economic indicators are called leading economic indicators. One of those is the index of leading economic indicators. And the other, and probably to me, probably the most important, is the Consumer Confidence Index. The reason being is cons- consumer confidence drives purchases. So if you're the current economic situation, think of that. When there's uncertainty, people do not make major purchases. They don't buy durable goods. So they don't buy cars and refrigerators and televisions and so forth. So the it's um, you know that that's what but it's when if consumer confidence is low, uh, it is likely or a low or falling. It is likely that we are headed into a recessionary period. Future direction of inflation. Inflation is generally always going up, although um, the Federal Reserve over the past 30, 35 years has done a really good job of managing inflation. So some inflation is seen as necessary as part of economic growth, but excessive inflation is detrimental to the economy. The type of inflation that countries in South America have seen and so forth is uh, is what we're talking about. So, what is inflation? Inflation is a steady rise in the general level of prices. So, how does inflation affect consumption? Well, if prices go up and our income doesn't go up, we have less what we call real income. We have our, our income isn't going to go as far as it previously did, assuming our income is the same. So what happens is we have to make decisions as to what we purchase and don't purchase. Um, so and I'll give an example of this later in this chapter. So, how is inflation measured? And the main uh, measure of the inflation is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. You'll hear that reported on a regular basis on the news. The probably more importantly, but harder to measure, is your personal inflation rate. The Consumer Price Index uses what's called a market basket of goods, which show that it's for the entire economy. But for example, the inflation rate where you live could be much higher or much lower, depending on the economic situation where you live. So, so as I said before, inflation reduces real incomes. So what that means is you have less less money to apply to your purchases because the cost of those purchases have gone up, and you have to make decisions with regard to how to allocate your money. So, um, interest rates, the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is set by the Federal Reserve, and it's the rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans. It is uh, a key indicator with regard to what the Fed thinks is going on in the economy. If the economy is expanding, many times the Fed will raise it to kind of slow down economic growth to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. The Fed will also reduce it to stimulate economic growth. So, um, so we'll start with concept check 1.2 on the next lecture.